Previously on Casual Historian.
Perhaps I should look at the comments of that video.
You are telling what went on in the Bible, but you are not telling the truth about who the people who are black.
What?
This fat little putz is giving the false history that he wants to enforce. Tribe of Judah is black.
Make a note to check out that random blacks are the real Jews stuff later.
Before you started worshiping totem poles, you was worshiping the true living God.
Turning up with Esau. Esau on this caveman thing. I'm turning up. Cause you know what? You dirty bastards better be ready. You better be ready.
Okay, well, that's good because everybody should be racist. If racist means just stick to your own kind. Cows hang around cows. Lions hang around lions. Sheep hang around sheep. Snake hang around snakes.
There's no discussion with you. You're an unreasonable devil. All right? That's all people are. Unreasonable devil.
He don't know a damn thing. Solomon said in the book, The Wisdom of Solomon, 1 verse 5 and 6, I am black. And Solomon was the son of David, so how the hell David was going to be written? Shut down. What you're talking about is that the Lord's going to bring on you for the acts that the Klan have committed and the government of the United States. How you stole this land from the so-called North American Indians. So we're not just like the Klan. We're talking about what God is going to do to you.
Now, blacks and Latinos and Native Indians for hundreds of years, and Jesus Christ is going to reward you for it. Destroying your people. I hope you get ready for slavery. The salvation Jesus Christ is coming to bring is to put you and your people, you pigskin goddamn devils, in slavery. That's right. All right? I hope you're ready for when a big angry black man called Jesus Christ comes to put your people in captivity, man. Because that's all that's coming to your damn people. You do understand that, right?
We're going to show you that the Bible said we shouldn't be integrating anyway. What Martin Luther King did, retarded, ridiculous. He should have never been trying to integrate. That's not our hero. Integration sets us back. Every time a major black figure tries to bring us together and desegregate us, integrate us, that sets us back 40 years. So give me that in Deuteronomy.
The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32 and 8. When the Most High divided the nation.
The Bible says in the beginning, the Most High divided the nations, not brought them together.
You know what I'm saying? You know, if you got faith that says as much as a mustard seed, you know what I'm saying, you can move mountains. And the mountains that, you know, we trying to move right now is this virus that these camps are teaching our people. And we need to get rid of those viruses. You know what I'm saying?
You just said some of the doctrine of the camps is a virus. Are you sure you want to use that word? I'm not, but why use the word virus in relation to the doctrinal teaching?
Because I caught it. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, right. So that's why I say it's a virus.
I had no idea these guys even existed a year ago.
Many people's first encounter with them was at the Lincoln Memorial incident at the March for Life, when the Native American activist, Nathan Phillips, made national news by harassing those high school kids. However, by the time it came out that the Black Hebrew Israelites were the true instigators behind the whole incident, they were well within my radar. Back in 2018, I published a video about different theories around the origins of the Jewish people. I was expecting the comments section of the video to be flooded with anti-Semitic comments, and at first all the usual suspects were there. You had your neo-Nazis, Christian identitarians, Islamists and Palestinians, along with Marxist anti-Semites. However, I started getting comments asking why the Jews I depicted in the video weren't dark-skinned. At first I assumed that they were wondering why the pictures didn't show more Arab-looking Jews, but the comments continued and I began to see more assert that the quote, real Jews were black and the so-called Jews in Israel were Khazars from the Synagogue of Satan.
And this is when my research began.
I fell down a rabbit hole of pseudo-history and self-proclaimed prophets telling me the Israelites and Jesus had black skin and whites were the spawns of the devil. I found a huge internet subculture of African Americans who sounded like they were playing a game of Mad Libs written by Nazis. I learned that this was more than just an internet thing, that this insane racist set of beliefs also manifested itself in the real world. with groups of black guys cosplaying what they think ancient Israelites dressed like, all the while harassing people in public. I also learned that this movement was older than I thought, and that its origins were less ugly than I had assumed. I knew I had to make a video about it, and I figured since I made a long video about white supremacists earlier this year, I could justify making one on black supremacists as well.
Okay, then what is this thing? What do we call it? Well, it's known by many names, but the most common one, which happens to also be the one used by Wikipedia, is the Black Hebrew Israelites. Many of the groups that fall under this label don't use it, and many that do don't like it. However, this label was once used by these groups themselves, and it's also probably the best descriptor of what they actually are and believe. Oh yeah, something else to keep in mind. The Black Hebrew Israelites are not a group, but rather a movement.
There are many factions and countless little differences between these groups. The one thing they have in common is the belief that the biblical Israelites were black-skinned, and that those brought to the Americas as slaves in the transatlantic slave trade were descendants of those Israelites. Beyond this point, they are helplessly divided by the bigotry of small differences.
This belief in their descent from the biblical Israelites is referred to as Israelism, or more specifically, Black Israelism, and this is probably where we should begin our deeper exploration. This belief that a group not traditionally associated with the biblical Israelites are actually descended from them is referred to as Israelism. There are groups of people around the world who believe they are descended from the biblical Israelites in places like Ethiopia, Afghanistan, India, Britain, France, and the United States, as well as many others. And these stories originate from the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests of Israel and Judah in the 8th and 6th centuries BCE.
The Kingdom of Israel was founded around the year 1000 BCE. Within a century, it split into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. The northern kingdom was conquered by the Neo-Assyrians in 722 BCE, and the southern kingdom was conquered by the Neo-Babylonians in the early 6th century BCE. These conquests resulted in the dispersing of the Israelites. The leaders of Judah were taken to Babylon, but the fate of the northern tribes is uncertain. References to those tribes dropped dramatically after that point.
These tribes are commonly referred to as the Lost Tribes of Israel, and many myths have been built around their mysterious disappearance. I mean, after all, what better origin story could you have than you are descended from one of the tribes of God's chosen people? The consensus view of historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists is that the northern tribes were assimilated into the cultures that conquered them. However, the Bible talks a lot about the reuniting of the tribes as though they were scattered.
Then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are at the ends of the earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. Deuteronomy 30:3-4. Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people, who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he will lift up a standard for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Isaiah 11:11-12. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God, because I made them go into exile among the nations, and then gathered them again to their own land, and I will leave none of them there any longer. Ezekiel 39:28. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare in the coastlands afar off, and say, He who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. Jeremiah 31:10.
So the Bible makes a big deal about the tribes being scattered and then one day being reunited. Well, both Jews and Christians have kept an eye out for the lost tribes for the last many centuries.
Throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, Jewish merchants traveling around the world claimed to have found one or more of the lost tribes. Christian explorers did much the same thing when navigating and mapping the world out in the Age of Discovery. The Jews, persecuted throughout Europe, wanted to find their lost tribesmen as a means of self-empowering, while Christians searched for the lost tribes in hopes of speeding up the second coming of Jesus. What should be mentioned, however, is that none of these people, recognized by European Jews and Christians as being lost tribes of Israel, ever recognized themselves as such. We don't see any Europeans self-identifying with the Israelites until the Reformation. Many Protestants saw themselves as restoring the true church. These beliefs resulted in some reformers embracing Old Testament practices, believing that modern Christians should live more like the early Christians, most of whom were Jewish and continued some form of Jewish practices after their conversions. This self-identification with the spiritual role of God's chosen people leads to some postulating that they were the real Israelites. This idea became popular in Elizabethan England, with England being called the New Jerusalem. This belief was pretty rare until the 19th century, when we see the British Empire begin to expand around the world. Many embrace this belief as a theological justification for the success of the British Empire, seeing that it was preordained by God. These beliefs also spread to the United States and other British settler colonies. In the United States, it transformed from Anglo-Israelism into the Christian Identity Movement, which is a white supremacist movement that believes white people are descended from the Israelites, and that the people who call themselves Jews are actually false Jews as described in the book of Revelation, frequently with the moniker of the Synagogue of Satan. The historical rationale for this is that some of the tribes that left Israel fled north into the Caucasus, where they intermarried with the Scythians, who are believed to have intermarried with the Goths, who intermarried with the Angles and Saxons, who then invaded Great Britain in the 5th century CE. And from there, the Anglo-Israelites expanded around the world. These beliefs were popular amongst Masonic groups, many of whom incorporated these legends into their rituals and teachings. This was probably one of the influences on Joseph Smith Jr., a Freemason who founded the Latter-day Saints Church and the Mormon religious movement. The Book of Mormon details the escape of a family of Jews from Jerusalem before the Babylonian conquest to the Americas, where they became the main ancestor to the American Indians. The exact details of this belief have evolved over time, but the Israelism has remained. The most famous kind of Israelism, however, has been Ethiopian Israelism. Ethiopian Israelism is, as the name suggests, the belief that the Ethiopians are descended from the Israelites. Well, not exactly. More precisely, it refers to the belief that the practicing Jews of Ethiopia are descended from the biblical Israelites. This is probably the oldest form of Israelism, and it's the one with the most actual historical and DNA evidence. Around the world, there are communities of people from Ethiopia that believe they are descended from the biblical Israelites. This community of practicing Jews has been recognized as a distinct group since at least the 4th century AD, first appearing in the record around the same time that the Empire of Aksum converted to Christianity.
Older texts refer to these Jewish communities as falashas. However, this is generally considered a derogatory term, and so most use the phrase either Ethiopian Jews or Beta Israel. Now, some people also find Beta Israel to be a derogatory term. However, it is a term that is commonly in use by Ethiopian Jews themselves, and also, no one who is offended by this term is an Ethiopian Jew. So how exactly did the Ethiopian Jews come to be? Well, they're not exactly sure. They have multiple stories and theories about their origins, most of which have to do with the Israelite tribe of Dan.
One theory suggests that during the Exodus, a portion of the tribe of Dan went southward towards the Horn of Africa instead of northeast towards Canaan. A different theory comes from the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba visited Jerusalem during the reign of King Solomon and brought with her many gifts and then returned home. Scholars believe that the land of Sheba is referring to the southern Arabian kingdom of Saba, which at some point controlled parts of modern Ethiopia. The idea is that during her visit to Solomon's court, she became pregnant with her child, Menelik I of Ethiopia. The stories also tend to include a number of Israelites, usually from the tribe of Dan, traveling back to Saba with her, thereby forming the basis of the Ethiopian Jews. Yet another theory is that after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom, the tribe of Dan, or whatever was left of it, migrated south to Ethiopia. And of course, some of these theories involve combining them together.
On top of all these old stories, there's also some genetic evidence to back it up. However, there's not enough to be academically conclusive.
Whatever amount was there, however, was enough for the modern state of Israel to evacuate thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel during Operation Moses in 1984 and Operation Solomon in 1991.
One thing I should note here is that Ethiopian Israelism is not the same as Black Israelism. Now, there are forms of Black Israelism that incorporate Ethiopian Israelism, but they are two distinct ideas that come about 1,500 years apart. So before we get into the mess that is Black Israelism itself, let's take a look at the history of the Black Hebrew Israelites and their origins.
The Atlantic slave trade brought over at least 12 million slaves from Africa. But due to the high death toll of the transatlantic journey, the total number purchased or taken from their homes is surely higher. They were brought to the New World to work labor-intensive jobs in an environment that most Europeans either couldn't survive or refused to endure. Back in Africa, they would have continued their traditional religious practices of worshipping numerous gods and spirits. But in the New World, they had long-term exposure to Christianity and the Bible, and the slaves would come to have an affinity for the Book of Exodus, the story of ancient Israelites escaping slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land. African Christians in the Americas would come to spiritually identify with the biblical Israelites. References to the Exodus story were very common amongst Negro spirituals. In antebellum America, those who escorted slaves through the Underground Railroad were frequently dubbed Moses, most famous of which being Harriet Tubman, Black Moses.
This collective experience made blacks in America uniquely susceptible to this kind of belief. I mean, after all, who else in the Christian world could point to the story of Exodus and claim a similar struggle?
This spiritual identification wouldn't stop with the abolishment of slavery. It continued after the Civil War, especially after the end of Reconstruction, when Southern Democrats took back control of Southern state governments and began implementing Jim Crow laws. The retaliation against newly freed blacks in the South was devastating, resulting in thousands fleeing. Luckily, there were those trying to build a new world for them out west. During the Civil War, Congress passed the Homesteading Act of 1862, which allowed any person who hadn't raised arms against the U.S. to apply for free land out west, including newly freed slaves. At this time, much of the western frontier was governed by Republicans, who enticed newly freed blacks to settle and create black-majority counties in Kansas, and there were even attempts to make the Oklahoma Territory a black-majority state. The Great Plains today are seen as a bastion of Christian fundamentalism, but it was even more so back in the 19th century.
Those who came out west were very religious, and even more so during hard times. The levels of religiosity out west were so high that there was an overabundance of preachers, to the point where settlers were complaining about men becoming preachers that they didn't want to do real jobs. They didn't want to do manual labor. They were lazy considered. And this religiosity would be amplified by the holiness movement coming out of radical Methodist churches. Methodism and the holiness movement are based around a concept known as the second work of grace, the first work of grace being baptism. The idea was that baptism would wash your sin away, and then a second work of grace would come and change your life in such a way that you would stop voluntarily sinning in the world.
The more radical parts of this movement wanted to restore the era of apostolic Christianity. What this means is that they wanted modern Christianity to be more like it was after Pentecost, when Jesus ascended into heaven and the apostles began to receive special gifts, in Greek called charisma. When you hear people talk about Christian prophecy or the ability to speak or understand tongues, that's all part of charisma. The traditional understanding of the apostolic age was that it ended with the death of the first apostles, and therefore the special gifts also ceased to be given.
This desire to make Christianity more like it was in the early days resulted in many churches incorporating Jewish rituals and practices into their own. The idea was that since most early Christians were Jewish converts who continued to do some kind of Jewish practice after they converted to Christianity, the thought was they should be as well. This resulted in some churches celebrating Jewish holidays like Passover, or circumcising their sons, abstaining from pork, and many other Jewish practices, as well as moving the Sabbath from Sunday back to Saturday. This is where we get groups like the Seventh-day Adventists from.
This form of Christianity was less focused on scripture and doctrine and emphasized a more emotional relationship with God. This attracted many black Christians who, thanks to lower levels of literacy, tended to emphasize the same things in their churches. This is where we get the first generation of black Hebrew Israelite movements.
The earliest known person to have preached this message was a former slave from Mississippi, William Christian. In 1888, he received his first revelation, telling him that the biblical Israelites, along with Jesus, was black, and that the freed blacks in America were their descendants. It's around this time, at the age of 32, that he founded his church, the Church of God and Saints of Christ. By the way, get used to that, because when you study this subject, you'll get that name a lot for churches. Along with teaching that blacks were descendants of the Israelites, he also taught that black skin was a sign of the covenant between God and his chosen people.
This was taught in contrast to how many white Southerners had theologically interpreted black skin as the curse of Ham. One of Christian's more problematic teachings was that the white race were actually descendants of fallen angels, which in some Christian traditions are interpreted as demons. Despite this origin for white people, Christian preached racial equality amongst his followers.
Unfortunately, we don't have much information on William Christian. In fact, I couldn't even find a picture of the guy. But that's okay, because the next person we're going to be covering would have a lot more influence than William Christian, and is usually the one given credit for starting this whole movement.
Born 9 years prior to Christian, we have William Saunders Crowdy. He was born a slave in Maryland in 1847, and his master served as a spy for the Confederacy during the Civil War. The state of Maryland would abolish slavery in 1863, granting Crowdy his freedom, at which point he joined the Union Army as a cook. After his time in the Army, he moved out west, working as a cook in Denver, Colorado, where he married his first wife in 1874. We don't know what happened with his first wife, because he is recorded as getting married again in 1882 while living in Kansas City, Missouri. He would move again to Iowa and then back to Missouri, finally settling with his wife and 3 children in the Oklahoma Territory in the early 1890s, where he acquired land and became a farmer.
Prior to his first revelations, Crowdy had a number of influences that were all driving him towards Black Israelism.
The first and most obvious was his experience as a slave, embracing the Exodus narrative as his own like many slaves had. There was also the religious atmosphere of the frontier, with the holiness movement pushing Judaization on many Christian congregations. Beyond that, we also find that Crowdy was a Freemason, a member of the Black Masonic Lodge in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and as mentioned earlier, the Masons were fond of Israelism and identification with King Solomon. And even further than that, Crowdy is said to have been a fan of the works of Booker T. Washington, who promoted black economic development and independence as a means of racial integration. With all this in place, he was primed. He just needed something to push him over the edge.
He received his first vision on September 13th of 1892. For years prior to this, he had been hearing voices and things that had been causing him to act strangely. But this Tuesday evening, everything would come to fruition. He was working out in the fields of his farm when he heard a voice telling him to run for his life. And so, he began running. He ran to the nearby woods, leaving marks on trees as he's going through in hopes that his family could find his body, because he assumed he'd be dying that day. He ran and ran until he collapsed from exhaustion and began to dream. In this dream, he was in a dark room with lights coming down onto tables. All these different tables were of different sizes. They were all covered in filth, and they had the names of different Christian churches on them. The biggest of these churches, the biggest of these tables, with the most filth on it, was the Baptist Church. But there was one table that was clean. It was smaller than the others, but it was a place proper for a faithful man to sit. And on that table was carved the name Church of God and Saints of Christ. Crowdy sat at that table and was then given a set of rules for him and his new church to follow, as well as being given a special book, which he ate in reference to an Old Testament prophecy. When he awoke, he knew that he had to dedicate his life to spreading the message of God. He began his preaching in his home of Guthrie, Oklahoma. However, his message wasn't well received there, even less so by fellow blacks. Crowdy felt the need to spread this message outside of the Oklahoma Territory, but his wife wasn't going to let him do that, unless he took his son Isaac with them. According to one of Crowdy's daughters later on, the reason for this was because his wife suspected that Crowdy may have had a mistress and was planning to abandon his family to be with her. Now, considering the fact that he had a first wife that we have no idea what happened to, this might shed a little light on what happened to that first wife, as in, Crowdy may have abandoned her. Regardless of the reasoning, William Crowdy left with his son Isaac to the state of Kansas, where they would wander around and preach what he believed to be the Word of God. And along the way, Crowdy would be physically and verbally abused because the people thought he was insane.
Over time, he got better at preaching, and therefore better at avoiding physical abuse, and eventually gained some followers, most of whom were white at first. He finally got enough followers to formally establish his church in 1896, with congregations in Lawrence, Emporia, and Topeka. He would appoint his first bishop a year later, a white man named J.M. Groves, in 1897. That same year, he made his first missionary trips east of the Mississippi, first to Chicago, where he was not received very well, and then to the Northeast, where he spoke with Pentecostals. While in the Northeast, he found that his message was more readily received by wealthy whites than by wealthy blacks. While in urban areas of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, his message was mostly accepted by blacks.
Aside from the obligatory teaching that the Israelites and Jesus were black and that blacks were descended from them, Crowdy's church was not really that much different from other holiness movement churches.
They incorporated Jewish practices from the Old Testament into their Christian churches. Along with the scriptures, he included a number of other rituals such as foot washing and a sacred kiss between members. This was quite controversial at the time because in his churches he mandated racial integration, which was not the norm in most churches. His movement, like that of William Christian, was explicitly anti-racist. In 1899, he relocated the national headquarters for his church to Philadelphia in order to foster and facilitate its expansion on the East Coast, where there were a much greater concentration of black people than the Great Plains. This reflected the racial makeup of his congregations as well. Out west, his congregations were far more racially diverse, being about equal parts white and black. While out east, his congregations were almost exclusively black. While on the East Coast, his church also began to expand outside the United States to the British West Indies and to numerous parts of British African colonies. Some black colonial subjects from Africa went to school in the United States, and some of those who studied in Philadelphia were exposed to Crowdy's teachings. These students took these teachings back with them to Africa, and some of them used them as recruitment tools for rebellions against the British. Before these rebellions could occur, however, Crowdy would relocate his church headquarters to the Tidewater region of Virginia, near where Crowdy was born. From this position, the church began to expand into the South and Washington, D.C. Crowdy, however, would die in 1908, and his death would result in the schisming of his church. The racially mixed Western congregations had remained far more orthodox in their theology, retaining the Trinity and the Messianic status of Jesus, while Eastern congregations had gone further in their Judaization to the point where by the 1930s, they were churches in name only, and practiced a form of Judaism very similar to that of white Jews.
Okay, well, so far, the Black Hebrew Israelites don't seem too bad, Black Israelism seems to be, at worst, a quirky belief on par with, say, those in the Book of Mormon. So how do we get from that to this?
Whosoever down at the scriptures. No, I'm a public state. You can yell, I can yell too. For his children. It said prepare slaughter for his children. Yeah.
That story begins with a third self-professed prophet, whom most people lump in with the first generation, but I don't think belongs there.
When talking about the more verbose Black Hebrew Israelites you see accosting people on street corners, the explainer articles will tell you the brief history of Prophet Frank S. Cherry. Unlike Christian and Crowdy, Cherry was born after the abolishment of slavery. Cherry and his followers claim that he founded his church in Tennessee in 1886, and later relocated his congregation to Philadelphia in 1912. His church, called the Church of the Living God, the Pillar and Ground of Truth for All Nations, taught that whites were intrinsically evil, and that the world would end in the 20th century in a race war. He also taught that whites altered the Bible and other historical records in order to erase the blackness of important figures and groups. He believed that the Jews who fled Roman Palestine after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD fled into Africa, and eventually were captured as slaves and sold to Europeans.
A big difference in his teaching of Black Israelism versus that of Christian and Crowdy is that his is exclusionary, while theirs was inclusionary. Christian and Crowdy taught that both blacks and white Jews were descendants of the biblical Israelites. But Cherry taught an exclusivist message that only blacks in the Western Hemisphere are descendants of the biblical Israelites. It is exclusively their heritage. He bolstered this claim by accusing white Jews of being part of the synagogue of Satan spoken of in the book of Revelation. But this isn't the only reason why I don't think he belongs in the first generation. The bigger reason has to do with disputes around his date of birth.
For starters, there's virtually no documentation about Cherry's life prior to moving to Philadelphia in 1912. There's also contradictory sources around the year of his birth. His obituary claimed that he was born in 1868, which would have made him 18 years old at the time of the church's supposed founding. That is a tad young to found a religious movement, but not unheard of. However, if we look at the census records from the years 1920, 1930, and 1940, we find that he listed his date of birth as 1875, which would have made him at most 11 when he started his church in 1886. That's too young to be believable.
Here is what's probably going on. Living in Philadelphia, surrounded by not only members of Crowdy's church, but a bunch of the other copycat churches that were copying Crowdy's message, he gets inspired to start his own church. But Crowdy's started his church in 1896 and was seen as far more legitimate. So what does Cherry do? He goes like, oh yeah, well, my church was started in 1886. But you wouldn't have known about it because it was down in Tennessee. It's the equivalent of a high school guy claiming to have a girlfriend who lives in Canada. This combination of his teachings being very different from the first generation, as well as the lack of documentation around his actual church's founding, makes me lump him in with the second generation of Black Hebrew Israelites.
The first generation of Black Hebrew Israelites were defined by a reliance upon divine revelation, racial integration, and a more traditionally Christian theology. The second generation, on the other hand, would be more reliant upon pseudo-scholarship, segregation, and a rejection of Christianity. The first two generations are also separated by time period. The first generation was born in the 1880s and 90s, while the second generation would be born between the 1910s and 1930s. The historical and political environment the two were born into cannot be ignored. I think the most important dividing line between the two was the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which declared segregation of public facilities to be constitutional so long as they were equal in quality. Along with Plessy v. Ferguson, another event in 1896 influenced what would become the second generation of Black Hebrew Israelites: the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Italy had invaded Ethiopia in 1895 with aid from the British, while Ethiopia received aid from the Russians. After the Battle of Ottawa, the Ethiopians managed to drive the Italians out, which sent shockwaves around the world. This resulted in some of the Black holiness churches, especially in the West Indies, to emphasize Ethiopian Israelism as a substitute for Black Israelism, or as a supplement to it. This victory of Black Africans over white Europeans made Ethiopia a symbol of resistance to white imperialism for Blacks in Africa as well as the Americas. Ethiopia was the only independent country in the world run by Africans from top to bottom, which put the country in a special place among Black nationalists. Another important influence on the movement was immigration from the West Indies. Blacks in the West Indies were frequently practicers of radical Methodism, which frequently had elements of Israelism. This meant that Black immigrants from the West Indies were also predisposed to Black Israelism, and they tended to migrate to big cities in the US, where most of the congregations preaching Black Israelism were racially homogenous. The second generation of Black Hebrew Israelites would be fueled by immigrants from the West Indies. The first big name we see is Marcus Garvey from Jamaica. He worked as a printer in Kingston, where he became a trade unionist, and after his involvement in a printer strike, he was fired and was unable to get another job in the private sector. He bounced around the Caribbean for a couple years until he started working as a journalist, which took him across Europe and exposed him to the idea of Black nationalism and Ethiopianism. While in London, he came across Booker T. Washington's book, Up From Slavery, which inspired him to form his own organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, in 1914, which promoted Black entrepreneurism, Black nationalism, and Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey was not himself a Black Hebrew Israelite, but his organization would become a springboard for numerous people who would. One prominent figure that would come to Black Israelism through the UNIA was Arnold Josiah Ford. Ford was born in Barbados in 1877. He was a musician, a Freemason, and a veteran of the British Royal Navy. After his time in the Royal Navy, he studied music and language in London before he migrated to New York. While in New York, he met Marcus Garvey and became a member of the UNIA, and even wrote their anthem, Ethiopia.
A storm cloud at night suddenly gathers, all armies come rushing to thee.
Ford was exposed to both black and Ethiopian Israelism while a member of the UNIA, which resulted in him co-founding the Moorish Zionist Temple in 1920.
Anyways, it was around this time that Ford began using the title of rabbi and asserting that Christianity was a form of oppression upon blacks.
He would leave the Moorish Zionist Temple to found his own congregation, Beth B'nai Abraham, due to him wanting to pursue more Africanist ventures. These organizations and congregations had far more in common with Ashkenazi Jewish practice than the first generation of Black Hebrew Israelites. This was partly because the second generation rejected Christianity, but also because the founders of the second generation were living in urban areas and therefore had far more contact with practicing Jews than Crowdy or Christian had.
Despite having more actual contact with white Jews than the previous generation of Black Hebrew Israelites, Ford avoided using the term Black Jew to refer to himself or his followers, but rather preferred to use the terms Hebrew and Israelite in order to differentiate themselves from white Jews. However, similar to the previous generation, he did not preach an exclusive claim to descent from the biblical Israelites.
He claimed that Israelites originated in Nigeria and migrated northeast into Egypt and then into the land of Canaan, which is how he justified his belief that biblical Israelites were black. His explanation for white Jews still being descendants of the Israelites was that after the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, they were brought into Europe where they were intermarried with white Europeans, which after 2,000 years resulted in the Jews being white. But not all of the Jews were taken to Europe. A large number of them fled to Africa and spent centuries wandering from place to place until the start of the Atlantic slave trade, when native African tribes captured these nomadic black Jews and Israelites and sold them to the Europeans as slaves, and then taken to the Americas. As the 1920s went on, a portion of Ford's group wanted to integrate more into the wider Jewish community, while Ford himself wanted the group to become more African. This desire for greater Africanization of his group resulted in Ford leading a portion of his congregants to set up a colony in Ethiopia, the one African country free of white rule, whose emperor was believed to have been descended from King Solomon. This move to Ethiopia was part of a wider Back to Africa movement pushed by black nationalists such as Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. The movement was largely inspired by political Zionism, the desire to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Ford admired the Zionists for their political success, but was also very hostile towards them, believing and promoting a number of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, such as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. He believed that Jewish control of international banking was preventing the success of Pan-African movements. Well, despite all that, Ford managed to get himself and a small number of his followers to Ethiopia. However, he wasn't able to negotiate a land deal with the government, because they had laws forbidding foreigners from owning land. He and his followers found it difficult to make a living in Ethiopia. The land wasn't ideal for farming, and they had trouble acquiring funds for more industrial activities. They also had troubled relations with the local populace. The native Ethiopians looked down on Ford and his followers due to their ancestors being slaves to whites, which they saw as disgraceful. The nobility in Ethiopia, including the newly crowned emperor Haile Selassie, didn't embrace Pan-Africanism or black nationalism. They preferred to emphasize their Arab ancestry, which they saw as one of power and conquest, while downplaying their African ancestry, which they saw as weak. On top of that, the Jews of Ethiopia also didn't really care for Ford and his Hebrew Israelites, and refused to recognize them as fellow descendants of the biblical Israelites. So things weren't going too well. Most of Ford's followers would leave Ethiopia not long after they arrived. Ford himself would die in Ethiopia in 1935, shortly before Mussolini's invasion. The few followers who were left finally evacuated Ethiopia during the invasion, most of whom returned home to the United States and to the West Indies. A number of these returnees would go back home to Jamaica and contribute to the founding of the Rastafari movement. So yeah, Rastafaris are, in part, an offshoot of the Black Hebrew Israelites. I would go further into them here, but that's another can of worms I'll probably cover in its own video later. Until then, you can watch this History with Hibbert's video on the subject.
The most important thing Ford did while in Ethiopia was grant one of his followers still in the US the legitimacy they needed to continue his work. You see, Ford filed with the Ethiopian government an official ordination, or semika, to recognize one of his followers, Wentworth Arthur Matthew, as a rabbi, and so Matthews would be a rabbi in the eyes of the Ethiopian government.
For most of his life, Wentworth Matthew claimed to have been born in Nigeria to an Ethiopian Hebrew father and a West Indian mother. Looking back at Ford's teachings, he was clearly trying to set himself up as a suitable successor. However, documentation tells us that he was actually born on St. Kitts in 1892. He immigrated to New York, where he founded the Commandment Keepers in 1919 as a Christian church that taught Black Israelism and incorporated Old Testament rituals and practices. Over time, his group would lessen its ties to Christianity by de-emphasizing the role of Jesus and increasing focus on Hebrew identity.
The theology and rituals of the Commandment Keepers would be a mix of Freemasonry, Kabbalah, holiness movement, and spiritualism. Matthews had a tendency to change his style of preaching depending on who was in the audience. In particular, if he had audience with white people in it, he taught a more neutral message, while if his audience was only blacks, he would be far more anti-white in his preachings. The members of this group referred to themselves as Ethiopian Hebrews, thereby embracing the Ethiopian version of Black Israelism. Unfortunately for historians, there's not as much documentation or primary sources around Matthews and the Commandment Keepers as we would like, considering that he became very protective of his teachings and had many of these teachings that were secret to the organization. Matthews kept a pretty tight lid on this because there were other Black Hebrew Israelite organizations that had their teachings exposed to the public, and it made the public turn against them because some of them were pretty crazy. Like one of the ones in Chicago just ended up being a crazy sex cult. Anyways, because of this, he kept a tight lid on all of his teachings and became very weary whenever people would leave his organization. However, in the early years, he wasn't nearly as protective, and it's from these early years that we get some of his teachings, such as when justifying the belief that blacks in the Americas are descended from the Israelites.
He sometimes taught that the Ethiopian Hebrews were descendants of Menelik I, supposedly the son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. At other times, he said that the Ethiopian Hebrews originated with 2 Israelite tribes migrating to Ethiopia after the Assyrian conquest. He was one of the first ones to teach that the white race originated with Esau, the brother of Jacob, whose descendants are believed by some to have become the Edomites, who are negatively portrayed in numerous parts in the Bible. Similar to William Christian, he saw certain phenotypical features of African Americans as signs that they are of the Israelites, and in particular the tribe of Judah, such as the gap found in many African American front teeth as well as overlapping toes. Later in life, he began to open schools to teach his theology and pseudo-history to the members of the Commandment Keepers. By the 1960s, the Commandment Keepers had more or less eliminated Jesus from their theology and doctrine, at which point they edited their organization's name, which until that point had been the Commandment Keepers and the Faith of Christ, to simply the Commandment Keepers. Matthew would die in 1972. By that point, the Commandment Keepers had suffered numerous schisms, birthing the 3rd generation of Black Hebrew Israelites. After his death, his successors within the Commandment Keepers began a gradual process of expunging many of Matthew's teachings that were contradictory to mainstream Judaism. However, the more they did this, the more schisms the organization suffered. The organization still exists today, but it is a shadow of its former self.
The 2nd generation, which is defined in its contrast to the 1st generation, such as pseudo-scholarship and replacement of divine revelation, segregation and replacement of racial integration, and a rejection of Christianity rather than emerging from a Christian movement, would be succeeded by the 3rd generation, which is very much a movement of its time and its roots in Black power.
Following the 2nd generation of Black Hebrew Israelites, the United States and the world went through an economic depression and a world war. Many of these fighting men were American blacks, often thought to be fighting for the double V: victory abroad against fascism and victory against racism at home. The war resulted in a sizable number of African American veterans who believed that if they were asked to fight and die for a country, they should have the same rights as everyone else. This birthed a 50s and 60s wave of the civil rights movement, with figures such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. advocating racial peace and integration, or Malcolm X, who initially supported continued separation of the races. For some people, Dr. King's approach was too slow, too accommodating, and revolutionarily insufficient for their desires. This is where we get the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s was very similar to the works and goals of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. But Black Power, in the minds of groups like the Black Panthers, would go further in terms of political activism. The Black Panthers not only reflected some of the goals of the UNIA, but they built upon the many ideas and values. Point 5 of the party's 10-point program says, "We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present-day society."
This belief that there is some kind of conspiracy to hide the real history, the real truth of the world from African Americans is a focal point of the third generation of Black Hebrew Israelites.
The second generation saw the first major split in Black Hebrew Israelite groups, between those who were Tanakh only, meaning that they only used the Hebrew Bible, and those who were Messianic, or those who used at least some of the New Testament. The third generation saw another seismic shift between African Israelites and Black Israelites. Here's what I mean. By definition, all Black Hebrew Israelites believe that not only are the descendants of slaves brought to the Americas and the slave trade descendants of one or more of the tribes of Israel wandering around Africa, but also that the biblical Israelites were themselves black-skinned. The question that is dividing them is whether or not the Black Hebrew Israelites have any African ancestry. The African Israelites believe that they do, taking from people such as Arnold Josiah Ford, who said that the Israelites originated in Nigeria and then migrated to Canaan. The Black Israelites, however, believe that they have no African ancestry and that they are a completely separate racial group. Exactly how this split is justified will be explained later, but for now, this is the main division we see among the third generation Black Hebrew Israelites. Let's start by looking at the African Israelites, which will take us out of New York and over to Chicago. Under the leadership of people like Arnold Josiah Ford and Wentworth Matthew, Ethiopian Israelism also spread to the Windy City. The Chicago group was founded in 1918 by a migrant from India and was originally called the Ethiopian Hebrew Settlement Workers Association, but under the influence of Ford and Matthews it evolved into a synagogue, Beth Shalom B'nai Zaken, Hebrew Ethiopian Congregation. From this congregation would come Eliyahu Bui, who took classes from the Commandment Keepers. Bui would become an elder within the Black Hebrew Israelite community in Chicago, and his biggest contribution to the movement would be him introducing it to a co-worker, Ben Carter. Ben Carter was born in Chicago in 1939. He served time in the military, and according to his own biography, which some believe to be suspect, he was a bus driver in Chicago. Regardless of his employment history, he was first introduced to the idea of Black Israelism by Eliyahu Bui in the early 1960s, by which point there were numerous groups preaching. He began attending meetings and classes and eventually becoming so deeply involved that he changed his name to Ben Ami Ben Israel. This was a fairly common practice amongst non-Christian Black religious movements, the best known counterpart being the Nation of Islam, who had prominent members such as Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, both of which had changed their names in recognition of their new identity. In 1966, Ben Ami claimed to have had a vision from the angel Gabriel, who told him to lead African Americans out of the United States into the Promised Land in Israel. He spread his message to many of his friends and family both inside and outside the Black Hebrew Israelite community. Many of the older members from the second generation were critical of Ami's decision to lead a group of their members to Israel, believing that they should stay in America and fix the problems there, rather than running away. However, Ami believed and taught his followers that there was no fixing America's race problems, and that those who stayed would eventually face God's wrath. His group came in small waves, first to Liberia where they tried to purchase land, and then to Israel. They initially arrived in Israel under visitors' visas, but they quickly overstayed their legal residency. Despite that, however, the Israeli government initially left them alone. Ben Ami and his followers were eventually settled in Dimona, a village in the Negev desert. This is where they became known as the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, despite the fact that they were a good deal away from Jerusalem. Ben Ami and his advisors tried to claim citizenship in Israel via the Law of Return. However, the Israeli government refused to recognize their claims. No rabbinical institution within Israel recognized their claim to Israeli heritage. On top of that, the Black Power movements at the time tended to be political supporters of the Palestinian cause, and the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem were no different. So the Israeli government wasn't going to let a bunch of people who supported the Palestinians into the country and grant them citizenship. Whenever Israel did deport a number of their members, they would attempt to cause an international incident by accusing the Israeli government of being racist. However, considering their teachings about white Israelis and white people in general, this was a bit of the pot calling the kettle black. Do you remember that dictionary scene from Spike Lee's Malcolm X? Well, Black Hebrew Israelites of the third generation are obsessed with words in similar ways, attempting to ascribe deeper meaning to society by words colloquially used. Well, the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem take this to another level. This power to define is central to their entire global agenda and spiritual mission. They aim to redefine what it means to be African, what it means to be Jewish, and even what it means to be human. Attempting to rewrite the very science of human life, the basic parameters of our existence, requires that everything we say, think, and do, no matter how casually or seemingly unremarkable, becomes fodder for purposeful reconceptualization.
They take it to weird extremes, such as renaming commonly used phrases such as diet to live it, the Dead Sea to the Sea of Life, and deadline to lifeline.
All of these linguistic gestures are meant to rewire the brain's neurological circuitry.
On top of this obsession with language, they also believe that they can achieve immortality through veganism.
When it comes to backing up their claims of Israelite descent, they have a museum set up in Dimona. Now, it's not exactly good or convincing to anyone who knows what they're talking about. But if you're someone who doesn't know anything about it, and you're predisposed to believing that the truth has been hidden from you, then it might do the trick. They claim that the name Eden was the biblical name for Africa, and that modern-day Israel is a part of Africa. Yeah, the line would normally be drawn at the Suez Canal, shoots up and around Israel, the West Bank, and back down to the Sinai.
Although the AHIJ still believe that Black Hebrew Israelites do have African heritage, a la the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve being in Africa, they still believe that the Israelites were a distinct, separate group from Africans. And if you go to their museum in Dimona, Israel, you might get this spiel from one of your tour guides.
Why weren't the ancient slaves singing about the Niger River when they got to the New World? First of all, what happened during the slave trade? You have newcomers arriving to West Africa from Israel after 1,000 years of migrating, and at about the same time that Europeans arrived in Africa on their boats, rowing into the harbors to carry away millions of our people. There was most certainly collaboration on part of the Africans.
Along with the museum, they also give their own tours of Israel in order to undo
European Jewry's hegemonic articulation of the landscape.
This goes along with their anti-white beliefs, labeling places like the United States and Europe as Babylon. And if you're familiar with Christian and Jewish eschatology, you know that's not a good comparison to make. But unlike other Hebrew Israelite groups, they do not believe in an afterlife.
When men speak of the kingdom of God, they do so metaphorically. Our perspective is different. The scriptures told us that it will be established in this land, at a time when larger nations dominate the global scene. This kingdom would start as a mustard seed, minute and obscure, yet it will eventually grow and never be destroyed. What does this mean to mankind now? That somewhere in this land, there is a body of people dedicated to the fulfillment of this prophecy, in order that the words inspired by the Holy One of Israel will not fail? Moreover, it is clear that Israel must live out its prophetic purpose, to be a light unto humanity, demonstrating the benefits of living according to the Word of God.
Now, that's just how they put it online. But when you dig a little deeper, you realize what they really mean is that the world we live in is heaven or hell for different peoples depending on who's in charge. And so long as whites are in power, the world is hell for blacks and heaven for whites. and once blacks are in control, it'll be heaven for them and hell for whites. In the last couple decades, however, the AHIJ have tried to tone down the rhetoric a bit, finally being granted permanent residency status within Israel in the 1990s, as well as starting to serve in the military and gain citizenship. While the AHIJ took a more classical position within the Black Hebrew Israelite framework, the opposing end of the third generation would become far more hostile to outsiders.
The other half of the third generation are the One Westers. What exactly does this mean? Well, it refers to a particular piece of real estate. In the early 1960s, Wentworth Matthew and the Commandment Keepers set up the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge in Harlem on 1 West Street. It was during this time that Matthew's teachings became more extreme, becoming more and more racist. The teachings from this school became known as One West Hebrew Israelism, and from this school many Hebrew Israelite groups would emerge. The biggest reason for these schisms was the Commandment Keepers becoming Tanakh only, meaning that they were only using the Old Testament. Those who wanted to continue the teachings of One West with the New Testament broke off from the group. In 1969, one of Matthew's students, Abba Bivens, broke off from the Commandment Keepers and the ISUPK and formed his own school, the Israelite School of Torah. Bivens was the first Hebrew Israelite to claim that American Indians were also descendants of the biblical Israelites. Some of the schools and camps that descended and broke off from Bivens would also add Latinos to the list of Hebrew Israelites. After Bivens was murdered by some Muslim men in Newark, New Jersey, his school was taken over by some of his students, who renamed it the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, in order to claim legitimacy from the Commandment Keepers as the true school.
Under his students, the school would create its own form of Hebrew, because the kind used in Israel was too Yiddish. They also established the King James Bible as the one true translation of the Bible, and also began to incorporate the apocryphal text into their main study.
They also introduced what is known as the 12 Tribes chart. If you explore Black Hebrew Israelite social media, you will see replicas of this chart everywhere. Basically, it lists what modern peoples in the world are descended from the 12 tribes of Israel. In the early 1980s, the group renamed itself the Israelite Church of Universal Practical Knowledge as a bid to gain tax-exempt status, but they never received it. One of the leaders of the ICUPK, Arai, would revive a prophecy made by Frank Cherry, that the world would come to an end in the year 2000 and erupt in a race war, in which Hebrew Israelites, with the aid of God, would kill all non-Israelites. Some One West groups prepared for the coming race war, which they called Operation Megiddo, in reference to the town of Megiddo in Israel, from which the word Armageddon is derived. These teachings and activities resulted in the FBI monitoring the groups up through the new millennium. Operation Megiddo was never implemented, and with it, FBI ceased most observations of the group. Prior to the failure of the prophecy, Arai made a mistake within the ICUPK by proclaiming that one of its members, Moshe, was the reincarnation of King David. Moshe took the opportunity to make a bid for leadership, and when it failed, he took a number of its members with him to form another group, the House of David, which fell apart in 1999 after Moshe's death. The failure of the prophecy resulted in Arai losing power to another member, Azadakiah, who renamed the group the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ, ICGJC. He is said to believe that he is the human incarnation of the Holy Spirit.
The ICUPK and the Commandment Keepers at this point have had so many schisms and breakaways that, numerically speaking, none of them are relevant. The third generation of Black Hebrew Israelites is something of a synthesis of the prior two. It has the divine revelation nature of the first generation, while embracing the pseudo-scholarship and the segregationist nature of the second generation. Where it makes itself unique from those two, of course, is its exclusionary claim to descent from the Israelites. White Jews are not Israelites in their eyes. They are, at best, just white people that converted to the religion of the Israelites, and at worst, they are imposters from the synagogue of Satan from the book of Revelation. Now, throughout this video, I've been giving brief explanations of some of the beliefs that the Black Hebrew Israelite groups have. However, I felt that some of these beliefs deserve their own section to be explained. without all of that extra historical generational baggage stuff. So, I think the first thing I think we should explain is the origin of white people. Now, I'm sure some of you thinking, shouldn't there be an explanation for why the Jews are actually black rather than white people existing? My response to that is, you need to think very differently about this. You need to completely alter your perspective. The Black Hebrew Israelites believe that most characters in the Bible were black.
Adam and Eve, Abraham, Moses, Kings David and Solomon, along with Jesus and his disciples, black.
To them, black is the norm, and everything else is an aberration. Now, aside from William Christian's story about white people being descended from fallen angels, which is not very common amongst Black Hebrew Israelites, there are two primary origin stories for the existence of white people. One comes from Matthew's, in which he believes whites are descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob, grandson of Abraham, and the other comes from the story of Noah, and this comes from the book From Babylon to Timbuktu by Rudolph Windsor. And considering that the Noah story, chronologically speaking, happens before the Jacob and Esau story, let's talk about that one first.
Windsor starts his narrative with deciphering where the Garden of Eden was. For Windsor and most Hebrew Israelites, this is important because to them it proves that Adam and Eve were black. Locating where Eden was is dependent upon geographic details given in Genesis, and that usually means locating the rivers. Two of the rivers mentioned in the text are the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. But the other two rivers, Gihon and Pishon, have not been identified. Different people and groups have identified these two rivers with the Nile and the Ganges, meaning that the Garden of Eden could theoretically be as large as this, or as small as this. The river of Gihon gets identified with the Nile because it is said to water the land of Cush, which is associated with Ethiopia. Windsor takes this position. Because the Garden of Eden is associated with the land of Ethiopia, we can conclude that the people were black.
Yeah, those are some big conclusions to jump to, but it gets bigger.
We should not search for Gihon in Africa. There were two Ethiopian nations in ancient times. There was an Ethiopian civilization in southern Mesopotamia, Babylon, but the people in this region did not use their tribal name, Ethiopia, to designate their nationality. They called themselves by the name of the cities they constructed and inhabited. This is why the Ethiopian tribes called themselves Babylonians.
This book is so frustrating to interrogate because there are almost no sources in it backing up any of its claims. The author claims to have received degrees from Temple University in Philadelphia, but if he really has a degree that he says he does, he should know how to cite sources better. But there are barely any footnotes, and the few that are there aren't addressing the big claims he's making. And you see this? This book is very, very tiny. It's clearly not meant to be read by anyone who is going to be thorough or dissecting with the material. So from my perspective, the book was clearly written as a piece of propaganda. So yeah, he claims that there are two Ethiopias, one in Africa, one in the Middle East, and that we know they're both black because one is associated with Africa. It doesn't get better from here. Anyways, now that we know that Adam and Eve were black because the Garden of Eden was in Africa, where did white people come from? Well, that's where the story of Noah comes in.
For those of you who don't remember, the story of Noah involves the great flood when God was going to start the whole world over, except for Noah and his family. After the flood, Noah's 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their children spread out across the world to repopulate it. Ham and his children are said to have gone to Africa. Shem and his children are said to have populated the Middle East and Asia, and Japheth and his sons are said to have populated Europe and the Mediterranean. Now, we know that the Japhites, Europeans, are white today. Were they originally white beginning from their ancestor Japheth, or did a change materialize in the skin color of the descendants of Japheth? This question is difficult to answer. I was told Japheth was a black man, but he wanted to be white, so God changed him to a white man.
Once again, no sources, but he continues.
Evidence to that theory is lacking. Nevertheless, scientists and anthropologists have found different kinds of mutations in certain parts of the world. A physical mutation is a sudden variation or change. Albinos are a good example of mutations with their white skin. Any sudden change from the normal is to be regarded as a mutation. In other words, they were black at one time, but their skin changed to white.
So he selectively uses science to back up his conclusions. Lovely. Okay, so the full picture is 2 out of 3 of Noah's sons were black. And that the third one either was made white by God or his descendants became white through sudden genetic mutations. Okay then, well, there are people in the world who are neither white nor black, so how exactly do we get all these non-white and non-black people? Well, the simple answer for him is miscegenation.
Basically, everywhere but Europe was populated by black people until the pale-skinned Indo-Europeans invaded, interbred with the local populaces, and thereby making all of their skin tones less dark. Rudolph Windsor published his book in 1969 at the height of the Black Power movement, which plays into its political contexts. Windsor would also go on to be a delegate at the National Black Political Convention in 1972.
The next theory we're talking about involves linguistics in a language that I don't understand, so I enlisted some help.
It's a great question. First of all, Jews are not a race. We come in all colors. There's certainly African Jews. I mean, Jews are originally indigenous to the Middle East, but having traveled around the world, the Jews of Africa look African, the Jews of Europe look European, and the Jews of the Middle East look Middle Eastern, the Jews of India, for example, look Indian. So I think it's a hard question to look to a biblical text to prove, I say that in quotes, race. But to specifically answer your question, Esau in Hebrew is Esav, which comes from the word meaning they made, or he was made. And it's a very common Hebrew word that shows up in a lot of different prayers and songs. And it is understood that he was called this because he looked completely developed, that he looked like a grown man. I'm not sure if that means his features or, facial hair, but he something about him looked completely made, so they called him Made. And another interpretive understanding of his name, and Jews love to interpret the Hebrew Bible and move beyond the literal meaning, is that it is a play on the word not only asu, made, but esev, meaning grass, as in he was covered with hair like grass covers the ground. So that's what his name means. What's interesting is a few verses later with the story of the trading of the birthright, so to speak. Jacob was simmering a stew. Esav came in from the field. Esav said to Yaakov, "Give me now some of that red stuff." And therefore they called him Edom. So evidently, Made One, or Grassy Hairy One, had a nickname, Red One. Edom is also a very common Hebrew word, which means red, but it's directly related to the words for blood, which is dam, the word for human, which is Adam or Adam, and also the word for land, Adamah. So again, I think you'd have a hard time proving race from those comments, and obviously scientists will tell you race itself is a social construct anyway. So his name was Made. It appears to be an allusion poetically to grass, and he was nicknamed Red, evidently because this was not his first experience in eating red lentils.
The Black Hebrew Israelites have a large obsession with, whites being descendants of Esau, the Edomites. And they play into a lot of negative things that both the New and Old Testament say about the Edomites. What are some things that the Old Testament says about them?
So keep in mind that the association of Esau with anyone other than himself is much later.
Yeah.
The text doesn't, for example, the rabbis who are particularly the medieval rabbis who are trying to see lessons from in their time in the Bible say, oh, it's very simple. Yishmael is the descendant of what become the Muslims. Esau must be the ancestor of what becomes the Europeans and the church. Again, that's a very selective, poetic, midrashic reading of the text. So we have Esav, who's known as Edom. It's not a stretch to connect that with the Edomites. The Edomites are most likely the people who lived in modern-day Petra, the Red City of Jordan, and much later into the Torah, into the Hebrew Bible, when the Hebrews are on their journey from Egypt to Israel, the Edomites don't let them come into their land. They have to circumnavigate this area, and this is probably pretty consistent with the history of that area. This was an area that often was on the trade routes and wanted to remain secluded. So yes, there's friction between the Edomites and the Israelites. Again, I think drawing any modern race lesson from the stories of Yaakov and Esau or the Edomites is not going to get us too far, because the Torah is largely silent on what were people's racial orientation. And we're talking about a Middle Eastern population, which is certainly heavily influenced by Africa. So it is likely that all of the people in the story are people of color, as we might say today. And I don't think we can get too much detail from the name Edomites.
So
nothing about it suggests, by the way, white. If anything, it suggests that these are people with coloration. But Edomite probably comes from the red rocks of Petra, and not the story of Jacob's brother eating lentils. But assuming racial identity from that is problematic and also not necessary, because there's no notion that Jews are one color.
All right, fascinating. Okay, so it's funny that the Black Hebrew Israelites have this mix of rejecting all non-sort of biblical sources as being authoritative, while at the same time seeming to take some things from Talmud or Midrash that make it convenient for their beliefs.
Well, this is the standard approach of anyone trying to prove a point, is to take a, and this is within the rabbinic tradition as well to some extent, but the idea of taking a proof text is a useful way of proving a point, but obviously the proof text appears in a context other than just the point that's trying to be proven. And it's not fair to the text to select, one or two lines and say, okay, now this is authentic and the rest is not because it doesn't agree with my theory. Either the book is sacred and meant to be studied, or it's not. The idea that this line is right but all these other lines are not is not, I think, fair or really honest to the text. And I don't have, if there are people who wish to connect with Jewish identity, that's certainly their right. It walks a thin line between appropriating Jewish texts, particularly the idea that actual Jews are not Jews and they are the real Jews. That's a little bit difficult for me to swallow. Again, knowing that there are African Jews, the notion that there has to be some attempt to disprove Caucasians as being Jewish is just really not, to me, a useful pursuit.
I also asked him about the description of King Solomon in the book Song of Songs that Hebrew Israelites like to use to justify the Israelites as being black.
Great, so let me first comment on the King James Version. Every translation is inherently a commentary. You can't translate a word without choosing this word over that word. That's putting a spin on the words, which is why Jews traditionally read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, and certainly are comfortable moving beyond its literal meaning, but start with what do the words mean. Too many of the Christian translations are in fact translations of translations, and things get lost in translation. So the verse that you're talking about, and Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, is certainly poetry. It's not presenting itself as any kind of history. The phrase that is used is shachora, which means black. And in the same phrase, though I am black and I am beautiful, I am shichor choret. I am one of these of the people who are black or dark skinned. And then the next verse continues: Do not view me with contempt. It is but the sun which has glared upon me. So we're talking love poetry. The man in the song, the woman in the song, it goes back and forth. It's seen, by the way, as an allegory to God and the Israelites. But putting the allegory aside, these are two people speaking of themselves and the other one in flirtational tones. And what seems to be implied here is, look at me, I'm very pretty. Is this referencing olive skin? Is this referencing African skin? Not clear. I mean, Solomon, at least according to the more historical sections of the Hebrew Bible, had many wives. It's understood that that is a potential origin story of the Ethiopian Jews is some kind of peace treaty through marriage with the Queen of Sheba, who was African. Is the poet imagining that it is in fact the Queen of Sheba that is saying this line, or someone similar? Certainly a possibility. So I would say the line does seem to be, in this phraseology, Shechora ani, I am black. That's pretty straightforward. What does it mean? I don't know. I'm not familiar if 3,000 years ago, at the time of Solomon, was Shechora, black, a way of saying African, or a way of saying, olive-skinned, or a way of saying sunburnt, or any other, or it could even be an emotional, phraseology. Some have likened it to I am, more like there's darkness, there's wickedness. It's very difficult to use poetry to prove any kind of historical or legal precedent. I mean, it would literally, let's read Robert Frost and construct laws from that. It wouldn't work. It's poetry. And here, it's poetry that's meant to have rich, multiple meanings. So yes, the word shechor means black. What does it mean in this context? Not really clear. Again, so physically darkened, emotionally darkened, spiritually darkened. I think we're meant to see it as all of these different possibilities. It's like a good song that you listen to over and over again and notice some new insight. It's not meant to be just one thing.
The Hebrew Israelites are also quite fond of the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28, which they see as a prophecy about themselves, but traditionally Jews and rabbis have seen it as a warning.
And so the context is always important. We have their first question was about the patriarchs and the founding stories of them. Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, is a much later text, which is love poetry. And here we have a concluding text towards the end of the Torah, towards the end of Deuteronomy, where it is a lengthy discussion of don't make the wrong choice. You're given free will. Life and death and choices are in front of you. But make the wrong choice, it will have the wrong consequences. And so what it says is, and it's very clear, the meaning of this, Mitzrayim be'aniyot b'derech asher amarti lecha. God will return you to Egypt in ships, on the road, on the path of which I said to you, you will never see it again. So the ultimate threat to the Hebrews, to the Israelites, to the early Jews was you will lose your homeland. It's a very small land. It's as we know to this day a contested land with lots of different, a difficult neighborhood as it were. And so the text is saying if you live in harmony with the land, everything will be great, for you and the land. If not, you will not remain there. And so what's the worst punishment possible? To go back to Mitzrayim. So Mitzrayim literally means the narrows or the straits. It consistently refers to the place of Egyptian, of Israelite servitude. Interestingly enough, the Arabic word for Egypt is very close to the Hebrew word Mitzrayim. I believe it's Misri or something like that. I'm not an expert on Arabic. So Mitzrayim refers to the place that they were slaves, which was Egypt. The idea that this is a reference to being sent as slaves to the Americas, that's completely not what the verse is saying. Egypt on boats is the phrase, and what that's implying is it's going to be a speedy return. It took you 40 years of wandering to leave Egypt, to leave slavery, to make it in to reclaim your ancestral land. If you do not merit remaining in the land because you are not living in justice and in equanimity, you will be returned be'aniot, by way of ships, specifically on the path that God said to you, you're never going to see this again. Well, stings to be you, you're going to see it again. So it's a threat. This is what will happen if you continue to make the wrong decision. You will be sent back to the place of constriction, the place of confinement, the place of slavery. and it won't be a long, slow journey. The path will be speeded up by you being back there on boats. And keep in mind that to this day, Israel is sandwiched between Egypt, Africa, and the rest of the Near East in terms of Babylonia, Iran, Iraq. So it's saying you're surrounded by potential warring nations, and if you lose your spiritual lease to this land, you'll be back where you were originally enslaved, starting with the time of the patriarchs. So I would be very hard pressed to translate this or derive any other meaning than specifically what it's saying. Don't mess up, or you'll be back in Egypt by way of a boat.
So as we can see, the way the Black Hebrew Israelites interpret Scripture doesn't really jive with the way either Christians or Jews have interpreted the biblical text. However, if you thought this is where the weirdness stopped, then I implore you to follow me down the rabbit hole a little further, because I am going to take you to a whole other level of revisionist pseudo-historical nonsense. Okay, so you're a Black Hebrew Israelite, sitting there thinking about how Abraham, Moses, Solomon, and Jesus were all black. But is that enough?
What if all the major figures of Western and European history were also black?
Aristotle? Black. Shakespeare? Definitely a brother. And you can't forget about King James I of England.
How come you're using the King James Bible?
What?
Why that edition? I thought King James was a white devil.
This is King James right here. Take a good look. He looks like Billy D. Williams, if you ask me.
You say so, brother.
Yes, there are Black Hebrew Israelites who believe that King James I was black. And it's all because his hair is curly. Now, were you thinking earlier when I said that the Black Hebrew Israelites use the King James version of the Bible? Didn't it seem odd that this black supremacist group would use a Bible attributed to a white guy? Well, this is the reason why. He was black the whole time. That made it okay. In fact, not only was King James I black, but most of the monarchs of Europe were also descended from black Israelites. That's why it was called the Dark Ages. Because they were all dark-skinned. This is too stupid for me to make up. I am not this clever. I am not this creative to think that the Dark Ages were the Dark Ages because everyone was black.
When it comes to King James I, as well as most figures they claim were actually black, they focus on their hair and how curly it is. If you read some of their literature or encounter their websites or posters on street corners, they will usually show you some digitally compressed black and white pictures of a photograph of a royal painting or drawing. They will show people this and say he looks black in his black and white picture. However, there are plenty of other paintings of King James from the time period before and after he became king, and in all of them he looks like another pasty white Scot. They play similar games with actual portraits of early Christian figures, pointing to how dark the skin on the person looks. Therefore, he must have been black. Doing this completely ignores the fact that these are old works of art that have collected dust, dirt, and grime over the centuries, making everything on the picture look darker than they really are. Cleaning and restoring these portraits to their original pristine condition is often expensive and potentially dangerous to the painting. So those in charge of retaining and maintaining the works often choose to not restore them in order to avoid further damage. And if you point this out to them, they will usually say that that is a part of the conspiracy to hide the truth. And the Black Hebrew Israelites buy into many of the same conspiracy theories that white supremacists do. Except now the entirety of the white race is in on it as well.
But we're not done yet, because despite the Black Hebrew Israelite beliefs being less than substantiated, they have a far bigger cultural influence within the black community, especially the hip-hop industry, than can be understood from the outside. The Black Hebrew Israelites have a surprising amount of influence within the hip-hop industry, some artists being openly affiliated with them, and others being secretly influenced by them.
In 1998, the rapper Doug E. Fresh featured a member of the Hebrew Israelites in the music video for his song, Rising to the Top.
Continue through the venue, didn't pretend to be nothing but Doug E. As a brother extended out his hand to me and asked me, would I rock the microphone? I just gave him a pound and I said shalom.
In 1998, Killah Priest referenced the Hebrew Israelites in his song, One Step.
Yo, check this out. Early natives related to the thrones of David, captured by some patriots and thrown on slave ships. They strip us naked, while the wise pick their favorite. Lives were wasted in the hands of the hated.
Do you guys remember Chingy? You know, this guy? Well, apparently he's a Hebrew Israelite now.
Before I say this verse, all praises to the Most High. Sitting on the throne, Chingy the king, what I go by. Jumped off the slave ship to a spaceship, boy, I'm so fly. Cut your triangle eye with my short mind, that's no eye. You in the kitchen cooking up, trying to bake a pie. I'm reading about my past deception, trying to cremate a lie. Guess I should talk about bottles, girls, the hood, and guns. I've gotten sicker that you son of sin, I'm God's son.
In 2011, Timbo King, an affiliate of the Wu-Tang Clan, released an album titled From Babylon to Timbuktu, which was intended as a reference to the book by Rudolph Windsor.
You can trace my bloodline to ancient pharaohs in Egypt. Follow my family tree down to the roots and find Jesus. From Babylon to Timbuktu. William Cooper, Black Market. Hey, yo.
Kodak Black also claims to be a practicing Hebrew Israelite. However, this seems to have not impacted his music very much.
But the biggest name adjacent to the Black Hebrew Israelites is Kendrick Lamar, whose relative Carl Duckworth is a member of the Israelites United in Christ, or IUIC.
Counterfeits, but now I'm counting this. Parmesan with my accountant lips. In fact, I'm down in this.
Despite Lamar not fully committing to any Hebrew Israelite camp, he is definitely letting it influence his music.
I'm not about a religion. I'm an Israelite. Don't call me black no more. That word is only a color. It ain't facts no more.
What's up, family? Yeah, this your cousin Carl, man. Just giving you a call, man. I know you've been having a lot on your mind lately. I know you feel like, people ain't been praying for you. But you have to understand this, man, that we are a cursed people. Deuteronomy 28 and 28 says, the Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart.
The Black Hebrew Israelites are also very active on social media, sharing memes and propaganda. And if we go outside the realm of pop culture, I would like to introduce you to the International Israelite Board of Rabbis, which was set up by students of Arnold Josiah Ford and Wentworth Matthew. This is the biggest organization of black rabbis in the United States. Currently, its chief rabbi is a man by the name of Capers Funnye, the rabbi of the Ethiopian Hebrew congregation in Chicago.
Now, what's so important about this person, you ask? Well, he is a cousin of former First Lady Michelle Obama. And, just as a bonus, you remember that Rudolph Windsor guy, from Babylon to Timbuktu? Well, guess what? He is an associate member of the Israelite Board of Rabbis. Fun. So what do we make of all this? This quest for some kind of identity, something better than what you think you are. Now, I personally don't have this strong desire to find some super special identity, but then again, I know what my family history is. I know the names of my relatives who first arrived in the United States. On my mother's side of the family, it was a Welshman who arrived here in 1698. And on my father's side, it was, my dad and his parents arrived here in 1958. I know my family history. I know where they came from. I know my heritage. But I can only imagine that for a people who don't know where they came from, this is an ever deep hole that you'd be trying to fill. And when that particular group of people are those who have been, historically speaking, marginalized in some way, I can imagine you want something special out of it. You've felt different kinds of oppression or pain. You want your suffering to have meant something. You want your suffering to have mattered. There's nothing in the secular world that can tell you that your suffering means something more than just that, the pain itself. That's why most secularists are also socialists. As far as they see it, pain has no meaning. Pain is simply either a byproduct of material inequality or in some cases an intentional affliction. But it has no greater meaning than that.
Religion, on the other hand, can give meaning to pain, meaning to suffering. I mean, in fact, that's kind of the whole story of the Bible. In the Old Testament, it's the story of the Israelites and then following them the Jews, of how they're constantly going through these struggles of they disobey God's laws, and then God removes his protection and allows them to suffer. And the whole point of the suffering in this context, in this theological context, is for them to learn, to become better than they were before. The same thing can be said with the New Testament and the death and, according to the scriptures, resurrection of Jesus. The whole purpose of his suffering on the cross was for something greater. There is a meaning behind the suffering. Well, when you try to find something like that outside of the religious realm, you're going to find some kind of nationality, I guess. And identifying with God's chosen people seems to give meaning to suffering. But that's how I see it anyways. I see this whole thing as a means of trying to find some kind of identity, something to say that you are, in a world where what you do doesn't matter as much. But let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. This video was brought to you by my very supportive patrons over at patreon.com/casualhistorian. Thanks to your support, I can afford to take time to make big videos like this on niche subjects that YouTube isn't going to reward with the algorithm or anything else like that. So thank you very much for supporting me on Patreon. And if you want to become a patron as well, you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian to find out more. And for this video, there's 2 additional pieces of content on the Patreon. There is the full interview I did with Rabbi Shlomo that you can find, and you can also find the fully footnoted script for this video as well on the Patreon. If you're interested in learning more about this subject, I have listed my sources down in the description. And amongst those sources, there are also some Amazon affiliate links. Buy those books or anything else through those Amazon affiliate links, and it'll help support this channel. You can also find an Amazon wishlist where I have books and other things that I'm going to use to make future videos. You can support the channel that way. But beyond anything else, the biggest thing you can do to support any channel is to watch the videos, watch them all the way through, and then share them. Show YouTube that this video is worth your time, and they'll think it's worth other people's times as well. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'm tired of making videos about hate groups, so I will see you next time.
Nobody's born hating another person. A mad world puts that poison in us. But if we can learn to hate another person, then we can learn to love a brother or sister or another.